Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a road that stretches across the entire galaxy. Not a metaphor for some grand human ambition, not the hopeful poetry of a navigator staring into the void, but an actual road. A vast, shimmering labyrinth of tunnels that bypass the storms of the warp entirely, where distance loses meaning, where a single step through the right doorway places you somewhere tens of thousands of light years away. A network so immense that entire cities, entire civilizations have made their homes inside it. A road that has existed since before humanity first climbed down from the trees, built by beings of such staggering intellect and cosmic patience that they might as well have been gods. That road exists right now, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, and almost no one uses it. Let that sink in for a moment, but because it is one of the most quietly devastating facts in the entire 40k setting. Right now, in the era we play our games and read our books and paint our miniatures, there is a hyperdimensional network of tunnels threaded through the space between real space and the warp that connects nearly every inhabited corner of the galaxy. It was built by something that makes the greatest achievements of every other civilization look like children scratching patterns in the dirt. It has been there for tens of millions of years. Parts of it are still functional, people still move through it, cities still exist inside it, and humanity, one of the most numerous and energetically violent species in the galaxy, cannot use it, does not use it. It has been effectively locked out of it for 10,000 years, by a chain of events so tangled with tragedy and manipulation and genuinely catastrophic mistakes that it takes a full accounting of galactic history to untangle. You can look at those sealed tunnels and those lost gates and that imprisoned emperor on his dying throne and trace every thread of the disaster back to a single night, a single act, a single moment when everything that might have been good about the future of the human species was burned away. The Imperium of man, that sprawling, fractured, dying empire of a million worlds, relies on ships that plunge headfirst into the most dangerous dimension in existence every single time they need to go anywhere. Navigators slowly losing their minds to the pressure of staring into the warp. Astropaths burning themselves hollow, sending psychic messages that may or may not arrive in the right century. Geller fields flickering against the pressure of things that would unmake the crew if they got through. Every journey in the Imperium is a gamble, a pact with probability, a quiet prayer that the tides of the Empyrean will let you through this time. Entire fleets are lost. Entire planets fall out of communication for decades because the warp storms are too thick for anyone to navigate. Colonists arrive at their destinations to find that they left 100 years ago and the colony has been dead for decades, or that they somehow arrived before they set out. And all of this sits in the shadow of a road that could have made all of it unnecessary. The warp is not just dangerous, whilst it is fundamentally incompatible with the long-term survival of a technologically dependent civilization. The more a civilization relies on it, the more exposure it has, the more of its soul it feeds to the entities that wait in those dark currents. Every navigator who peers into the Imperium to guide a ship loses something they cannot get back. Every astropath who sends a message across the stars pushes their mind into a medium that slowly reshapes everything it touches. The Chaos Gods feed on the psychic resonance of organic life, and humanity has been feeding them for as long as it has been using the warp for travel. The Webway would have broken that cycle. That was the whole point, and it was broken instead. Yet the story of why no one enters the Webway after a single catastrophic moment in the 31st millennium is one of the most layered tragedies in the entire 40k lore. It involves the oldest beings in the galaxy, a dying alien empire, the secret dreams of the most powerful human being who ever lived. One red-haired Primarch's fatal moment of arrogance, 10,000 years of consequences that are still unfolding, and a galaxy that has been bleeding ever since. Settle in and let this wash over you slowly, because this is not just a story about a broken road. It is a story about the single moment that sealed the fate of an entire species. It is a story about what happens when the best intentions in the universe are not enough. And it is a story that began, as so many of the darkest stories in 40k do, a very, very long time ago. Part 1. Ancient Architects. The Old Ones, and the birth of the Webway. Before there were Space Marines, before there were Eldar, before there were Chaos Gods, before even the first stirrings of human civilization on a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable star, there were the Old Ones. This is where you have to let your imagination stretch, not just across space, but across time itself, reaching back roughly 60 to 100 million years from the 41st millennium. The galaxy was unrecognizable then, populated by beings that made the most advanced races of the modern era look like children drawing pictures in the dirt. And chief among those ancient architects of existence were the Old Ones. We do not know exactly what they looked like. The elder myths and memories that survive into the modern era paint them as cold-blooded, impatient and ancient beyond reckoning, creatures of slow cosmic wisdom who moved through the universe the way rivers move through stone, with absolute certainty about where they were going and no hurry whatsoever to get there. They were likely reptilian in appearance, though even this is conjecture built on fragments and echoes. What we know of them comes filtered through the mythology of the Eldar, a species that came after them, and through the bitter hatred of the Necrons, who saw them as the source of all suffering. What the Old Ones did is not in question. They seeded the galaxy with life. That is not a loose metaphor. They literally traveled from world to world and planted the seeds of intelligent species, nudging evolution in directions that suited their purposes, creating beings with strong connections to the warp, and cultivating a garden of consciousness across 100,000 star systems. The Eldar themselves, the most psychically powerful mortal species in the current galaxy, were one of their creations, engineered as warrior races to fight on the Old Ones' behalf when war came calling. The Jokairo, those strange orange-furred technological savants who somehow make war gear that embarrasses the Adeptus Mechanicus despite apparently being simple primates. The Khanib, the Rashan, other species whose names do not survive even in legend, all of them seeded by those ancient travelers, and the war did come calling. But before all of that, before the conflict that would eventually leave the galaxy scarred for millions of years to come, the Old Ones built something that changed the fundamental nature of existence in this galaxy. They built the Webway. The principle behind it is deceptively elegant. The warp, the psychic dimension that underlies reality, is the most efficient medium for faster-than-light travel in the galaxy. The problem is that the warp is essentially a living nightmare. It is a dimension made of emotion, populated by things that feed on fear and suffering, governed by beings of near infinite power who view organic life the way a wolf views a lamb. Every time a ship plunges into the warp, it is stepping into a sea full of sharks, hoping the protection it has brought along will be enough. Sometimes it is. Often enough, it is not. The warp was not always what it is today. Before intelligent life reached the threshold where its psychic resonance began to seriously pollute the Imperium, the warp was a calmer place. Not safe, not without its own dangers, but not the roiling hell of 4 great predatory powers and their endless demonic legions that it has become. The Old Ones encountered a warp that was turbulent but navigable in ways that even the earliest Eldar Empire did not. But they still saw the danger inherent in relying on it, and they still wanted a better solution. The Old Ones, with their vast understanding of dimensional physics and psychic engineering, found a solution. They constructed a network of tunnels that sit in the space between real space and the warp. Not quite in the material universe, not quite in the Imperium, but woven between them like threads in a veil drawn over something foul. The substance of the Webway itself, built from materials and principles of psychic engineering that no modern race fully understands. It generates its own natural shielding against the demonic incursions of the warp. The walls of the tunnels are psychically resistant, self-sealing in places, and maintained by an intelligence that might be the network itself. The scale of this achievement is difficult to overstate. Imagine building a road. Now imagine building a road that spans the entire galaxy, that threads between dimensions, that has its own immune system, that can detect when something has gone wrong and begin to close off the infected sections before the damage spreads. The Webway is not just infrastructure, it is closer to a living thing, or at least a semi-living thing, something that responds to travelers within it, that has preferences and limits and a kind of self-preservation instinct built into its very architecture. The Webway actually has a documented immune response to intrusion. When a dolmen gate, the crude portals that the Necrons use to force their way in from the outside, punches through the Webway's walls, the network detects the breach. The arcane mechanisms of the Webway begin to seal off the infected spur, closing the compromised section behind the intruders and redirecting the flow of the labyrinth's passages to cut them off. Necrons who enter via dolmen gates are in a race against the Webway itself, needing to reach their destination and exit before the network buries the passage they came through. The Webway, on some level, does not want them there. This is not a program. This is not a machine executing instructions. This is something older and stranger, in a structure that has been functioning on some level of autonomous intention since before the fall of the civilization that built it. Inside the Webway, distance works differently. The scale of the passages shifts in ways that make conventional navigation meaningless. Some tunnels are so narrow that only a small strike force can pass in single file. Others are vast enough that entire fleets of spacecraft could sail through them with room to spare. There are regions of the Webway where time itself seems to behave strangely. The Harlequins, those enigmatic warriors who walk the Webway more freely than almost anyone else, speak of a place called Uigebealach, where time flows backward, and the crossroads of inertia, where time does not flow at all. This is not metaphor. This is a place where the rules that govern ordinary existence simply do not apply in the same way. Inquisitor Bronislaw Chevak, one of the few humans who has ever spent an extended period within the Webway, theorized that constant travel through it is part of what gives the Eldar their extraordinary longevity. He himself spent several decades inside those glowing passages, and when he emerged, he found that the experience had reversed his body's aging by several centuries. The Webway does not just move you from one place to another. It changes you in ways that are not fully understood, even by those who built upon it. The Old Ones used the Webway to wage war when the Necron, a short-lived, radiation-plagued species full of bitter hatred at their own cosmic lot in life, came looking for a fight. The Necron had been approaching the Old Ones for millennia before the conflict began, seeking the secret of long life from beings who appeared effectively immortal. The Old Ones, for reasons that are not fully recorded, refused. Whether out of arrogance or genuine belief that such gifts would do the Necron more harm than good, they turned away the requests. And in doing so, they created the bitterest enemies their civilization would ever face. The early wars between the Old Ones and the Necron were extraordinarily one-sided. The Necron had impressive technology, but they could not match the Old Ones' mastery of dimensional movement. Time and again, Old One forces that should have been surrounded and annihilated would simply step through a portal and vanish, reappearing somewhere entirely unexpected. The Necron called these the Gates of the Gods and could not pierce them. The Webway was not just a road, it was a strategic advantage so profound that it defined the entire early phase of the war in heaven, a conflict that would eventually reshape the galaxy beyond recognition. The Necron spent centuries trying to find a way to breach those walls. They failed, again and again, until the day they made the deal that would cost them their very souls. The Satan, those ancient energy beings that the Necron found living in the hearts of stars, offered them a bargain. Power enough to breach the Webway, power enough to finally destroy the Old Ones, in exchange for something the C'tan needed: bodies. The C'tan were effectively bodiless, pure consciousness without physical form, and the Necron had developed the technology to create bodies of living metal that could contain such vast and alien minds. The bargain was struck. The Necron became the Necrons, their flesh and blood exchanged for frames of eternal steel, their connection to the warp severed, their individuality and warmth slowly leaching away into the cold metal that now housed what remained of them. And the C'tan showed their new servants how to pierce the Webway's walls. The Old Ones, their greatest defense violated, their safe roads compromised, fought on in desperation. They created new warrior species, more psychically powerful even than what they had before. The Eldar emerged from this final act of the Old One's existence, engineered to be exactly the kind of psychically attuned, brilliant, dangerous fighters that could stand against the Necron tide. But the cost of all this war, the massive psychic resonance of billions of dying beings poured into the warp over centuries, was doing something to the Imperium. Things were growing there, nurtured by all that suffering and death, taking form from the emotional residue of the worst war in galactic history. The Old Ones disappeared from history. Whether they were destroyed, fled to some place beyond the galaxy's edge, or simply ceased to exist in any form that could be comprehended, is not known. What they left behind was a network of tunnels stretching across the entire galaxy, sitting empty and glowing softly in the space between dimensions, waiting for whoever came next to figure out what it was. The Necrons, Morgul, and having won the war in heaven through the C'tan's help, and then immediately revolted against their C'tan masters and shattered those star gods into slivers of their former power, retreated into their tomb worlds. 60 million years of sleep. The galaxy, traumatized and still bleeding from what had been done to it, was left to whichever of the younger species managed to survive the aftermath. The creatures that would eventually become the Chaos Gods, nourished by all that conflict, grew stronger in the warp. The Eldar, the Old One's finest creation, inherited what remained, and what remained included the road. Part 2. The Eldar Empire and the Golden Age of the Webway. The Eldar did not build the Webway. Let that sit for a moment, because it is something that even longtime 40k fans sometimes get wrong. The Eldar inherited it. The Old Ones, in the course of teaching their most capable warrior race the secrets of psychic engineering and dimensional travel, showed the Eldar how to enter and navigate the network. After the Old Ones vanished and the Eldar emerged from the chaos of the war in Heaven's aftermath as the dominant species in the galaxy, they did what intelligent inheritors of grand infrastructure always do. They moved in, learned how everything worked, and then started expanding it. The Eldar, at the height of their civilization, were something that defies easy comparison. Imagine a species that has been psychically attuned since its creation, whose every individual has a connection to the warp that humans cannot even perceive. And imagine a culture that had tens of thousands of years to develop arts and philosophies and technologies that make the best efforts of any other species look crude by comparison. The Eldari, as they called themselves, were the lords of the galaxy in every meaningful sense. Their empire stretched across countless star systems. Their craftwork, their psychic engineering, their understanding of the material universe was simply on a different level from anything that existed alongside it. When you look at what the Eldar left behind in the modern era, the Wraithbone constructs and the Spirit Stones and the barely understood artifacts that make Inquisitors and Tech Priests argue endlessly about their principles. You are looking at the debris of a civilization that was operating at a level that the 41st millennium has not come close to matching. The craft world Eldar of today, tragic and dwindling, fighting a losing battle against extinction, are the echo of what the Eldari were at their height. They are the fragment that survived. And at the heart of all of this was the Webway. The Eldar did not merely use the existing network. They mapped it obsessively, memorized its passages, and then began to add to it. New branches were constructed, new gates were opened, linking worlds and solar systems that the old ones had never connected. The ancient Eldar rebuilt and expanded with a thoroughness that only a species with millennia of uninterrupted civilization could manage, creating a pan-galactic network of navigable tunnels that made the distances of the galaxy irrelevant. An Eldar fleet could leave Craftworld Ultway, step through a Webway gate, and emerge on the far side of the galaxy without ever once touching the warp directly, without ever once exposing themselves to the predations of the entities that prowled those deeper, stormier currents. From the human perspective of the 41st millennium, this sounds like the most extraordinary luxury imaginable. It was simply Tuesday for the Eldar. The Eldar's mastery of the Webway had a subtler benefit beyond pure safety of travel. The Eldar soul is a bright thing, psychically speaking. Compared to most other species, an Eldar's soul burns with a psychic intensity that makes it uniquely attractive to the predators of the warp, and especially to Slaanesh, who would eventually be born from the resonance of Eldar emotion, and who, since that birth, has held a specific hunger for Eldar souls above all others. For a species this psychically vulnerable, a mode of travel that does not expose them to the warp at all is not a convenience. It is a survival mechanism. The Eldar think of human warp travel, the standard navigation through the Imperium that the Imperium depends on, as something close to suicidal insanity. From their perspective, it is roughly the equivalent of deciding to swim through a piranha-infested river when there is a perfectly good bridge right there. From the Eldar's perspective, there was always a bridge. They built it better and extended it further and trusted it with their lives every day. Within the Webway, the Eldar built port cities. Entire civilizations existed inside that dimensional space, in sub-realms and pocket dimensions that the Eldar had carved out within the Webway's vast interior. Some of these were enormous beyond easy comprehension. The Mechanicum analysts, who briefly studied a section of the human-built extension before everything went wrong, determined that one specific passage was so large that a human being would die of old age before they could walk its length if it had a bottom at all. The Webway's interior has its own internal logic of scale that does not necessarily correspond to anything in the material universe. There were cities in there that had their own suns, literal stars plucked from real space and installed inside Webway subrealms to provide light and power. Think about what that means for a moment. These were not simulated suns, are not fusion reactors designed to mimic stellar output. These were actual stars, lifted from their systems by technology that no modern civilization could approach even in theory, relocated into a pocket dimension within the Webway, positioned above cities of impossible beauty and complexity. The worlds those stars had once illuminated, deprived of their light, would have grown cold and dark. The Eldar of that age cared about this the way the ocean cares about a raindrop. The greatest of these port cities was established in what the Eldar calendar recorded as around the 18th millennium before the current era. It was called Commorragh, and it was the primary nodal point in the entire Webway network. From Commorragh, fleets could reach any major system in the Eldar Empire. It was the central hub, the beating heart of a civilization's infrastructure. Because it sat at such a uniquely valuable intersection of so many Webway routes, Commorragh was declared too important to belong to any single faction within the Eldar Empire. It existed outside their normal governing councils, a neutral space, an open port. The trouble with ungoverned neutral territory in the middle of your civilization's most important infrastructure, especially when that civilization is beginning to slide toward excess and moral dissolution, is that it becomes a haven for exactly the kinds of things that no one wants to officially acknowledge. Commorragh, free from the oversight of the great elder councils, became the place where the cults of excess that were slowly consuming the Eldar Empire retreated to avoid scrutiny. And it became a place where the most extreme experiments in sensation and experience, the darkest arts, the cruelest pleasures, could be pursued without anyone's official displeasure. And because it was the primary nodal point in the Webway, everyone had to pass through it. This should have been recognized as a catastrophic design flaw. The Eldar of that age were simply too absorbed in their own descent to notice. The fall of the Eldar is a story for another day, told in its own voice. But the shape of it matters here. As the Eldar Empire decayed into hedonism, as the sorcerers and pleasure cults and seekers of ever more extreme experience drank deeper and deeper from a well that had no bottom, they fed something in the warp. Their psychic resonance, the echoes of their extreme emotions, their pleasure and their pain and their cruelty and their art, all of it poured into the psychic dimension, collected and coalesced and slowly, over millennia, began to take shape as something that had never existed before. The chaos gods that exist in the 41st millennium were not inevitable. They are not some fundamental property of the warp. They were created, each one of them, by the collective psychic output of conscious species. Horn grew from every act of violence, every flash of rage, every murder committed by beings capable of recognizing what murder meant. Nurgle emerged from despair, from the acceptance of decay, from the particular flavor of sadness that comes from watching everything you love deteriorate. Tzeentch coalesced from ambition and hope and the endless scheming of minds that wanted things to be different. And Slaanesh, the youngest and in many ways the most directly destructive of the four, was born from the Eldar. Specifically, directly from the Eldar. Their civilization, at its height, had achieved such a degree of psychic and material mastery that their emotional output was richer and more intense than any species that had ever lived. Their pleasures were more extreme, their arts more refined, their experiences more layered. They felt more, in every direction, with more depth and intensity than human consciousness could track. And as their civilization descended, as the cults of excess drove the experience further and further toward the most extreme edges of sensation, all of that intensity poured into the warp and fed something that was slowly growing a face and a name and a hunger. On the day Slaanesh was born, a god of chaos ripped its way into existence and screamed across the entire galaxy. The birth shriek killed trillions outright. It tore through the Eldar Empire like a hand closing around a heart and squeezing. The Eye of Terror, that vast wound in reality that sits in the galactic northwest, the scar where the warp and real space merge in a festering, churning hell, was opened in that single moment. Nearly the entire Eldar species died. The psychic backlash of Slaanesh's emergence struck them hardest of all because they were the most psychically attuned, because their souls were the brightest, because they had, in a very real sense, created this thing that was now consuming them. The Webway took damage it had never experienced before. The energies of the fall ruptured hyperspatial pathways throughout the network. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough that huge sections of the Webway became dangerous, impassable, or simply lost. The network that the old ones had built to last until the death of the universe found itself, for the first time, genuinely wounded. But it survived. Damaged, yes. Sections collapsed or overrun by demonic energies that seeped through the wounded walls, yes. But the vast majority of the network still stood. The Eldar who managed to survive. Those aboard the great craft worlds. Those already hidden deep in the Webway who rode out the storm inside its protection. Those exodites who had migrated to the far fringes of the galaxy before the end. They still had access to the network. Diminished, yes. Frightened, yes. But they still had their road. It should be noted that the surviving Eldar of the craft worlds, was in the immediate aftermath of the fall, made a very specific decision regarding the Webway that would have implications for every human explorer who ever tried to use it afterward. They began sealing portals. Not randomly, not carelessly, but deliberately. Every Webway gate that led to a craft world, every passage that could theoretically allow an outside force to find and reach their homes, was locked and warded with whatever psychic defenses the diminished post-fall Eldar still had access to. When the Emperor's forces first entered the Webway through the human-built extension and began pushing toward the existing Eldar network. The Craftworld seers felt that presence and sealed the connecting passages. They did not know what the Imperials intended. They did not need to know. Anyone moving toward their homes through the most vulnerable passages was to be locked out. This is still true in the 41st millennium. Craftworld Eldari seers do not publish maps of which Webway gates lead to their homes. They keep those connections secret to the point where even their own warriors do not all have that knowledge. The Webway exists in part because of the Eldar's mastery of it, and that mastery is inseparable from the jealous guarding of its secrets. In the depths of Commorragh, those who had been inside the Webway when Slaanesh was born found themselves in a unique position. The warp entity that had consumed their kin could not reach them easily inside the dimensional labyrinth. Not easily. The walls of the Webway held against her, at least for a time, at least in the deepest subrealms. These survivors, yet the ones who had hidden in their palaces of excess while their civilization burned, became what we now call the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. They endured, at a cost that grows heavier with every passing year, because they had the Webway. After the fall, there was one being who could still walk every corridor of the network without fear. The laughing god, Segorach, the trickster deity of the Eldar pantheon, had survived Slaanesh's birth by hiding behind the war god Kaine's back. He retreated into the Webway itself, and with him went his disciples, those performers and warriors and storytellers who would eventually become the Harlequins. They know every path through the labyrinth dimension because their god knows every path. They are the last true masters of the network, the inheritors of all its secrets, are moving through its glowing passages with perfect confidence, while every other traveler feels the chill of uncertainty on their neck. The Harlequins are worth dwelling on for a moment, because they are the living embodiment of what the Webway means and what has been lost. They travel the passages in masks, performing their great theatrical works, the cycle of the Eldar's history enacted over and over, the fall and the hope and the endless grief of a species that knows exactly how it destroyed itself and cannot forget. They emerge from Webway gates onto the stages of history and perform for audiences of Craftworld Eldar and Drukhari alike, and then they vanish again into the dimensional labyrinth where their god lives. They fight against chaos wherever they find it, and they guard the Black Library where the most dangerous knowledge in the galaxy is kept, and they walk paths that no living being besides themselves and their god could navigate safely. This is what the Webway is in the age after the fall: ancient, vast, partially wounded, partially reclaimed, still functional along its main arteries, still hosting its strange inhabitants, and still, fundamentally, the single most effective travel network in the galaxy, into which the Emperor of Mankind had plans. Part 3. The Emperor's Secret Dream. The Webway Project. If you want to understand what the Emperor was trying to do, you have to understand the problem he was trying to solve. The Great Crusade, and that galaxy-spanning military campaign in which the Emperor and his Primarchs and their Space Marine legions fought for roughly 200 years to reunify humanity under the banner of the Imperium, required travel through the warp. There was no other option. The warp was the only medium for faster-than-light travel that humanity had access to, and every single time a ship jumped into the Imperium, it was exposed to everything that lived there. The danger was manageable. The navigators who guided the ships through the currents of the warp were valuable beyond measure. The Geller fields that protected crews from demonic incursion were carefully maintained, and the Astronomicon, that vast psychic beacon powered by the Emperor himself, served as a lighthouse that navigators could orient by. But manageable is not the same as safe. And the Emperor was thinking further ahead than anyone else. He was always thinking further ahead than anyone else. That was his gift and his tragedy simultaneously. He had a plan, not just to reunify humanity, not just to protect it from the dangers of the current age. He had a plan to sever humanity's dependency on the warp entirely, to make the Imperium irrelevant to human civilization, and in doing so, to eventually strangle chaos of the psychic energy it fed on. The chaos gods exist because conscious, psychic beings produce emotions, and those emotions pour into the warp and nourish the entities that live there. If you could remove a species as numerous and psychically resonant as humanity from the warp's feeding patterns, if you could deny those entities one of their primary sources of sustenance, but you would be striking at the heart of the problem in a way that no amount of military conquest could ever match. The Webway was how he intended to do it. Deep beneath the Terran continent of Asia, in the geological layers below what would eventually become the Imperial Palace, the Emperor had discovered something extraordinary. A Webway gate. Not one built by the Eldar who came after the old ones, but something far more ancient. A portal opening directly into the old one's original network. One of the very first doors ever cut into that dimensional labyrinth. This discovery happened, by some accounts, during the period of the Unification Wars, before the Imperial Palace was even constructed. The Emperor kept this find absolutely secret. Not from humanity in general, but from literally everyone. His primarchs did not know. His most trusted generals did not know. Only Malkador the Sigillite, his most trusted advisor and the second most powerful human psyker alive, knew the full scope of what the Emperor intended. Here was the plan, as the Emperor himself would later articulate it to the custodian Ra Endymion in the depths of the Webway War. The Emperor would use the ancient gate beneath the Imperial Palace as a starting point. He would construct new branches of the Webway, human-built extensions of the original network, linking Terra to the rest of the labyrinth dimension. These new tunnels would gradually extend throughout human space, eventually connecting all the major worlds of the Imperium. Unlike the original Webway, which was made from a psychically resistant material that the Eldar themselves barely understood, and humanity had no hope of replicating, the human-built extensions would be made from conventional materials. They would not generate their own shielding. This is where the Emperor himself came in. The Golden Throne, that ancient device he had discovered alongside the portal and spent centuries modifying, would serve as the nexus. Through it, the Emperor would project his psychic power throughout the entire human-built section of the Webway, maintaining the shields personally, his will serving as the substitute for the material's natural properties. It would require him to sit upon the Golden Throne and channel his enormous psychic might into maintaining those shields, essentially serving as the operating system for the entire network through sheer willpower. And at the heart of the Emperor's original vision, there was an even more staggering element. Yet he had a candidate in mind for the eventual role of permanent operator of the Golden Throne, someone with enough psychic power to maintain the shields indefinitely, someone who could take that burden from the Emperor himself once the network was sufficiently established. The evidence suggests, though it is never stated explicitly in the sources, that this candidate was Magnus the Red, the largest psyker in the galaxy, the being with the greatest connection to the warp of any of the primarchs, the mind capable of seeing across time and reading the currents of the Imperium like a book. Magnus, bound to the throne, his vast psychic power channeled into maintaining humanity's road through the dimensions forever. Whether Magnus knew of this plan, whether he would have accepted it, whether it constitutes the most tragic irony in the entire history of the 40,000 setting, is something we will return to. The project proceeded in absolute secrecy for over 2 centuries. The Emperor tasked the Adeptus Mechanicus with the construction work, tens of thousands of tech priests and unifiers, a new caste he created specifically for this purpose, digging and building deep beneath the Imperial Palace. He created a psychic shield around the entire project, wards of such power that they were effectively invisible to psychic detection from outside. The whole undertaking was known to those who labored on it only as the Emperor's great work, with the full nature of the project hidden even from many who were building it. When the Great Crusade was sufficiently advanced, when the Ulanor Crusade marked the tipping point where human victory seemed genuinely inevitable, the Emperor did something that shocked his sons and commanders. He stepped back from the front lines. He named Horus as War Master.
Okay, real talk for a second, because I genuinely think about this one more than most lore topics. What gets me about the Webway story is not the scale of it, even though the scale is enormous. It is the specific texture of the failure. Magnus was not stupid. He was probably the most intelligent being in the galaxy outside of the Emperor himself. He saw the future with clarity that no one else possessed. And he still walked into the trap, because intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. And because Zanj has been building this exact moment for years before Magnus ever sat down to perform that ritual. I think about that a lot when I look at the 40k setting as a whole. The question it keeps asking is not whether the heroes could have been smarter, it is whether being smarter would have even helped. The Emperor kept secrets because he calculated that was the right call. Magnus acted urgently because he calculated that was the right call. Both of them were wrong in ways that no one could have fully predicted from inside the situation. That specific kind of tragedy, where everyone is doing their best and the best is not enough, is what the Webway story does better than almost anything else in this lore. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Giving him command of all the legions, he returned to Terra. And he descended into the depths of the Imperial Palace and did not come back up. The Primarchs were baffled, resentful, some of them. Horus, who loved his father with an intensity that bordered on reverence, felt wounded by the withdrawal. What could possibly be more important than being with his sons in the final stages of the greatest military campaign in history? The Emperor would not say. The psychic walls around his project were too important to risk. Even for the people he loved most, even for Horus. The resentment that grew from that decision, or the hurt and confusion of sons abandoned in the field by the father they adored, was one of the threads that chaos would eventually pull to unravel everything. Down in the depths beneath the Imperial Palace, the work continued. The human-built section of the Webway gradually extended. Tech priests and laborers working by the light of psychic shielding that the Emperor maintained from his throne. They reached an ancient Eldar city within the Webway, a place of impossible architecture, that the workers named the Impossible City, though its Eldar name was Kalistar. It was the first foothold. From there, the network could branch and grow, spreading toward the rest of the labyrinth, and eventually connecting to the wider Eldar network. Everything was delicate. The Emperor had made this absolutely clear to the few who knew the project's nature. But the psychic shields were the only thing standing between the human-built tunnels and the demonic entities that prowled the borderlands between the warp and the Webway. Without the shields, demons would flood in within moments. The Emperor's continuous attention was required. He could not be interrupted. He could not be disturbed. The work was too sensitive, too fragile for any outside psychic intervention. He had, in a very real sense, made himself the most critical single point of failure in the entire plan. And then, Magnus the Red decided to send him a message. Part 4. Magnus the Red. The man, the myth, the mistake. To understand what Magnus did and why, you have to understand who he was. Not as the demon Primarch of Tzeentch he eventually became, but as the being he was before everything went wrong. Because Magnus the Red, was before the catastrophe, was arguably the most genuinely well-intentioned of all the Primarchs. He was found on the world of Prospero, a planet that had become a haven for psychers, humans with strong connections to the warp who had been driven from other human settlements by fear and misunderstanding. Prospero had become a civilization of the gifted, a society built around the careful and disciplined use of psychic power. And Magnus, when he arrived as a genetic seed that fell from the sky, like all the Primarchs had fallen across the galaxy when the Emperor lost them, quickly became the center of that world. He had one eye, a legacy of a bargain he had made in his early life, trading his eye for the knowledge to save his legion from the flesh change, the mutation that threatened to devour the 1,000 suns. Yet that eye stared into the warp with a clarity that no other being, not even the Emperor himself, could match. Magnus could peer into the streams of fate, read the currents of possibility, and see across time with an acuity that was simply without precedent. He was also, beneath all that power and all that intelligence, deeply human in the ways that mattered most. He loved knowledge. He craved understanding. He wanted to know the truth of things, the real truth, not the filtered and sanitized version that authority might prefer. He built a library that became one of the wonders of the galaxy, a pyramid of accumulated learning on Prospero that held centuries of psychic research and warp scholarship. He argued passionately at the Council of Nicaea, the great debate over whether psykers should be permitted in the legions, because he genuinely believed that understanding the warp was the only way to protect humanity from it. He lost that argument. The Emperor, for reasons Magnus could not fully grasp at the time, ruled against the use of psychic powers in the legions. All librarians were to cease their work. No sorcery, no divination, no psychic practice of any kind. The ruling felt to Magnus like a repudiation of everything he had built, everything he believed, everything his legion was. He nodded, accepted the ruling outwardly, and then continued his work in secret on Prospero, because he was also, beneath all that intelligence, deeply convinced that he knew better. This is not unique to Magnus. It is a character flaw that many of the Primarchs shared. They were created to be perfect soldiers, extraordinary commanders, beings capable of seeing further and planning deeper than any ordinary human. The line between that kind of confidence and outright arrogance is thin, and Magnus spent considerable time on the wrong side of it. He was also, though he perhaps did not know it at the time, entangled with Tzeentch in ways that went deeper than mere corruption. The 1,000 Suns had already been marked. The gift that Magnus had received for his legion's survival, the bargain that saved them from the flesh change the first time, had a cost that was still being collected in ways too subtle to perceive. Tzeentch, the chaos god of change, scheming, and manipulation, had been playing Magnus like an instrument for years. The entity who whispered to him at crucial moments. The nameless voice that offered assistance at the Council of Nicaea when he was desperate. The presence that lent him power when he reached for it. Magnus, for all his intelligence, had a blind spot the size of a titan when it came to how thoroughly he had been set up. On Prospero, in the months before the Horus heresy broke openly, Magnus did something that no one else in the galaxy could have done. He looked into the warp and he saw the future, the real future, not a possible thread, but what was going to happen. He saw Horus standing before the throne room of the Emperor, treachery in his heart, and a legion behind him. He saw the heresy as it would unfold. He saw the betrayals and the battles and the consequences. He tried to warn Horus first. He reached out psychically to his brother's mind and found it already too far gone, already wrapped in the coils of chaos, the corruption too deep to be reasoned with. But the contact failed. Horus rejected him. So Magnus turned his attention to warning the Emperor. The first obstacle was a massive storm in the warp, the kind of sustained psychic turbulence that made normal astropathic communication impossible. The slow, careful method of sending a message through the usual channels was simply not an option. The storm was too thick and time was too short. Magnus convinced himself, as he convinced himself about many things, that the situation was exceptional enough to justify exceptional measures. He began to construct a massive psychic ritual, one that would allow him to project his essence directly across the warp, directly to Terra, and deliver the warning in person. This ritual required sacrifice. It required reaching deep into the warp in ways that the Council of Nicaea had explicitly forbidden. Yes, it required Magnus to open himself up to powers he had been instructed to leave alone. He knew all of this. He proceeded anyway, because he was certain that what he was doing was right, and he was certain that the Emperor would understand once he heard what Magnus had to say. The astral projection of Magnus blazed through the warp like a comet, a spirit of fire and intellect moving faster than any physical vessel, burning through the Imperium on a direct course for Terra. And it was on that journey that he encountered something unexpected. A corridor. A specific corridor in the warp, near Terra, that was clearly artificial. A tunnel of some kind, its walls smooth and deliberate, with a faint psychic hum that he could not immediately identify. A passage that led, if his senses were correct, directly to the Imperial Palace. A shortcut, of sorts, a way through that would be faster than continuing through the raw warp. Magnus had no idea what he was looking at. The project had been kept from him, as it had been kept from everyone. He did not know about the Webway extension. He did not know about the Golden Throne. He did not know about the Emperor's psychic shields, or why they were there, or what they were protecting. What he saw was a wall he needed to get through, and on the other side of that wall was his father's palace. He pushed. The shields resisted. They had been built by the most powerful psyker in human history specifically to keep this kind of intrusion out, and they held. For a moment. And then a voice spoke to Magnus from within the currents of the warp. An anonymous voice offering help, offering just a bit more power, just enough to get through, just enough to reach his father. Magnus, in a moment of catastrophic, galaxy-altering hubris, said yes. The shields shattered. Part 5. The moment everything changed. The breach. You want to know what that shattering looked like from the inside of the project? Imagine you are a tech priest, one of the unifiers, working in the human-built extension of the Webway, beneath the Imperial Palace. You have been here for months, perhaps years. The work is painstaking. The tunnels are vast and strange. The acoustics do odd things in a space that exists between dimensions. But it is sacred work. The Emperor himself maintains the shields that keep you safe, and you can feel that protection like a warmth around the edges of your awareness. A constant low hum of something enormous, holding back the dark. And then the hum stops. Not gradually, not winding down. It stops, and the silence that follows it is not the silence of nothing. It is the silence of a gate swinging open on a night that is full of sounds you did not want to hear. And then the sounds come through. The breach that Magnus created did not open a small hole. The ritual he had performed, amplified by the nameless voice in the warp, amplified by the dark energy of a god who had been waiting for this exact moment, shattered the Emperor's psychic shielding completely. Every ward, every layer of protection that the Emperor had spent centuries building around the human-built section of the Webway was destroyed in an instant. The barriers that had been holding the daemonic hordes at bay simply ceased to exist. Multiple warp rifts, what the records would later call Magnus's folly, he tore open simultaneously throughout the human-built tunnels, and through those rifts poured everything that had been waiting on the other side. In the Imperial Palace itself, in the throne room where the Emperor sat upon the golden throne maintaining the shields, a figure walked out of the Webway portal beneath him. A flaming, enormous figure, an astral projection of Magnus the Red, blazing with psychic power and entirely unaware of what he had done. The Emperor looked at his son. There is no record of exactly what passed between them in that moment. Whatever the Emperor felt when he saw Magnus standing there, whatever combination of fury and grief and understanding and horror, he felt it in the context of simultaneously becoming aware of what was happening in the tunnels below. The shields were gone. The demons were inside. The workers were dying. The project that had been the cornerstone of his entire plan for humanity's future was being consumed from within. Magnus, so shaken by the realization of what he had done, retreated. He fled back to his physical body on Prospero without delivering his warning. The message about Horus, the reason he had come at all, went unspoken, because the messenger was too horrified by the damage he had caused to find the words. The Emperor was forced to do something he had never intended to do in this way, or at this time. He mounted the golden throne and sealed the portal, not to open it for travel, to close it, to use every scrap of his psychic power to hold that door shut, because on the other side of it were demonic hordes of a scale that would reduce Terra itself to ash if they got through. The great work, Humanity's road through the dimensions, its liberation from warp dependence, became instead his prison. Down in the human-built tunnels, the Custodians and the Sisters of Silence fought for their lives. The Custodians, those golden-armored warriors created by the Emperor himself from modified Astartes processes, were among the finest individual fighters in the galaxy. They had been stationed in the Webway as the project's military arm, defending the tunnels from the occasional demonic incursion that had always been a risk. They had never expected anything like this. The force they now faced was not an incursion, it was an invasion. The Sisters of Silence, the Null Maidens, the Pariahs, the psychically blank warriors whose very presence caused pain to psychic beings and drove demons into confusion. He fought alongside the Custodians in passages lit by the hellfire of entities that should not have been anywhere near real space. Their abilities, which made them uniquely suited to exactly this kind of fight, were all that kept the demonic tide from simply washing through in the first hours. Thousands of Mechanicum workers, unifiers and laborers and tech priests died in those first moments. The entire workforce that had been inside the Webway when the shields fell was butchered, consumed, or scattered into dimensions from which there was no return. Centuries of labor, the careful construction of humanity's future, became a war zone in a matter of minutes. And the damage to the Webway itself was not just physical. The demonic energies pouring through Magnus's folly were of a psychic intensity that the tunnels were not designed to handle. The human-built sections, already lacking the natural shielding of the original Webway, were particularly vulnerable. The walls cracked. The geometry of the passages began to shift and warp as chaos energy bled through. The impossible city of Kalistar, that first foothold the Imperials had secured, became a fortress under immediate siege. At the same time, across the galaxy on Prospero, Magnus waited. He waited for the Emperor to send someone to collect him, because he understood now that he had committed an act so catastrophic that no punishment could be too severe, and he had made his peace with that. He sat on the world he had built and waited to be brought to account. What he could not know, because the corruption of Horus had by this point extended its influence into the chain of command, was that the Emperor's order to bring Magnus to Terra was about to be intercepted and rewritten. The Space Wolves, led by their Primarch Leman Russ, had already been dispatched. By the time they reached Prospero, the order they were operating under was not to arrest Magnus and bring him to the Emperor for judgment. It was to destroy. Part 6. The War Within the Webway. The war that followed Magnus's breach lasted 5 years. Think about that for a moment. 5 years of continuous grinding combat in the tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace, in the passages of a dimension that sits between reality and the realm of nightmares. 5 years of the Custodians and Sisters of Silence bleeding and dying in defense of a door they could not permanently seal, fighting an enemy that replenished itself from an infinite source. The Custodians established a system of blockades. They found defensible positions in the tunnels and held them, using the strange geometry of the Webway to create choke points where their small number of exceptional fighters could hold back vastly larger forces. Behind those blockades, the Mechanicum workers who had survived the initial breach labored to repair the damage, sealing the warp rifts where they could, rebuilding sections of tunneling that had been corrupted. In front of the blockades, the Custodians and Sisters launched what the records call lightning-fast counterattacks. They did not simply sit and wait. They harried the demonic forces constantly, striking at concentrations before they could mass into an overwhelming assault, then withdrawing back behind their defenses before the enemy could respond in full force. As it was a war of attrition fought by beings who were already at a severe disadvantage in terms of numbers. The Custodes, that chapter of near-superhuman protectors that the Emperor had created as his personal guard, were reduced by 90% over the course of the war. 90%. Of the Custodians who entered the Webway, only roughly 1 in 10 survived to see the eventual, desperate withdrawal. 2 of the 3 commanding tribunes, the highest-ranking officers in the Custodian Order, died in those passages. A custodian tribune, Ra Endymion, eventually became the primary imperial officer by virtue of simply being one of the last to survive. The Sisters of Silence suffered proportionate losses. Their blank psychic presence, which made them invaluable against demonic entities, drew the attention of the Chaos forces in a particularly focused way. The demons, burning with the desire to destroy the beings who caused them pain just by existing, targeted the Null Maidens with a ferocity that went beyond tactical calculation and into something that looked very much like hatred. There are individual moments from the war within the Webway that survive in the records, preserved because they were simply too extraordinary to be forgotten. The death of Sister Celia, a sister of silence who held a threshold against a bloodthirster of Horn alone, her null presence chilling the air around the greater demon, her blade moving in strokes that slowly dismembered a being that could tear a main battle tank apart with its bare hands. She dispatched it, and then collapsed on the threshold between the warp and Terra's real space, and did not breathe again. Her final act was to deny the demon entry, nothing more, nothing less. As the war raged, the demonic forces were reinforced. Chaos Space Marines, those corrupted versions of the warriors who should have been humanity's finest soldiers, appeared among the demon legions. Corrupted Titans, those enormous walking fortresses of the Mechanicum, twisted beyond recognition by warp energy, strode through the wider passages. Greater demons of all four chaos powers joined the assault. The Emperor himself was not inactive during all of this. From the Golden Throne, his psychic presence was like a burning star within the Webway. The demons could feel him, a radiance of pure power emanating from the portal they were trying to breach, and it slowed them. It did not stop them. As nothing could stop them entirely while the warp rifts that Magnus had torn remained open. But it bought time. The impossible city, Kalistar, eventually fell. The position had been too exposed, too difficult to reinforce given the circumstances of the wider Horus heresy that was simultaneously tearing the galaxy apart. The treacherous Archimandrite, commanding the Mechanicum forces, was possessed by the demon Drachnian during the siege of Kalistar, and the already outnumbered Imperial forces found their backs against the wall as Kalistar was overrun. The retreat to the portal itself was the final stand. The custodians and sisters who remained formed a last line of defense directly at the entrance to Terra, fighting with everything they had left to prevent the demonic host from forcing its way through into the Imperial Palace. The Emperor, able to spare just enough attention from holding the portal sealed to project himself into the Webway, appeared among his warriors as a burning pillar of golden light that the demons could not approach without flinching away. It gave his warriors just enough room to evacuate. The last of the custodians and Sisters of Silence retreated through the portal. The Emperor closed it behind them. The human-built extension of the Webway was abandoned. All those years of labor, all those deaths, all those distances conquered and tunnels built, left behind and condemned. The portal beneath the Golden Throne was sealed, not opened for travel, not maintained as a connection to the wider network, but locked tight against the demonic hordes that pressed against it from the other side. The Emperor mounted his throne and kept it shut, and has kept it shut ever since. Part 7. The Golden Throne as Prison. Why the Emperor can never leave. This is the part that haunts everything. The Emperor is not on the Golden Throne because he needs medical life support. He is not there because his body was destroyed in the duel with Horus, and the machine is what keeps his consciousness tethered to the material world, though that element is also true after the siege of Terra. He was on the Golden Throne before Horus ever raised a hand against him, before the heresy fully erupted, because someone had to hold that door shut. The portal beneath the throne is not sealed in the way a door is sealed when you close it and turn the lock, and it is sealed in the way a door is sealed, when something enormous is pressing against it from the other side, and the only thing keeping it closed is the weight of everything you have against it. Remove the weight, and the door opens. The pressure never stops. The demonic forces on the other side of that portal are not going anywhere. There is no end to them. The warp is an infinite dimension, and its denizens are effectively endless. Since the moment Magnus's folly opened those rifts, an unimaginable quantity of demonic force has been pressing against the sealed portal, testing it, seeking a weakness. The Emperor is that weakness's only prevention. The records from the war within the Webway describe it with chilling honesty. Trillions upon trillions of demonic forms spawned in the eternal torrent of the warp, or hurling themselves against the gateway. The Emperor sitting on the throne, not fighting them in the conventional sense, not blasting them with psychic power, but simply holding the door. His entire consciousness, all of that incomprehensible psychic might, focused on the one task of maintaining the seal. And it requires everything he has. Malcador the Sigillite, perhaps the second most powerful human psyker who has ever lived, sat upon the golden throne briefly when the Emperor left to fight Horus aboard his flagship. Malcador was reduced to a husk in minutes. The effort of holding that portal closed, even briefly, even for a second, ground down one of the most extraordinary human minds in history into dust and ash. The Emperor then took his place back upon the throne and has held it ever since, for 10,000 years. But think about that number. 10,000 years of holding a door shut against infinite pressure. 10,000 years during which the most powerful being in human history has been unable to do anything else but sit in a chair in a basement beneath his own palace and fight a battle of pure willpower that he cannot afford to lose by even a fraction for even an instant. 10,000 years during which the Imperium has stumbled and suffered and bled and contracted because the only being capable of guiding it effectively has been physically and psychically unable to provide that guidance. The Astronomicon still functions, drawing on the Emperor's psychic output. Warp travel remains possible, though increasingly dangerous. But the Emperor cannot speak. He cannot advise. He cannot leave. Yet he cannot die without what follows being even more catastrophic than his imprisonment. The Golden Throne is failing. This is the other piece of the tragedy, layered on top of the first. The device was built for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not indefinite life support for a dying demigod. Its mechanisms are deteriorating. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the technological arm of the Imperium, has long since lost the understanding needed to repair it. They maintain what they can, but the underlying principles of the device's construction are beyond them. By the late 41st millennium, the throne is failing at a rate that frightens even those who have spent their entire careers trying not to acknowledge the problem. The machine works, in part, because of the 1,000 psychers sacrificed to it every single day. 1,000 human lives, every day without exception, burned in the throne's mechanisms to supplement the failing machinery and keep the Emperor's presence tethered to the material world. 10,000 years of daily sacrifice, over 300 million lives simply to keep the most important door in the galaxy shut. And should the Emperor die, should the throne fail beyond the point of repair, the portal does not simply close. The Emperor's psychic death would reverberate through the warp, with an intensity that the records suggest would eclipse even Slanesh's birth in its immediate impact on the surrounding reality. And on the other side of that portal, 10,000 years' worth of accumulated demonic pressure would explode outward into the Imperial Palace, into Terra itself. The device called the Talisman of Seven Hammers, installed by the Primarch Vulcan at the Emperor's direction, exists as a contingency against exactly this scenario. It is a dead man's switch. If the Golden Throne fails, the talisman detonates, destroying not just the Imperial Palace, but Terra itself, denying the demonic forces the symbolic prize of the Emperor's throne world, and preventing the breach from being used as a foothold for a demonic invasion of the rest of the galaxy. The home world of humanity is sitting on a bomb, and the fuse is the Emperor's heartbeat. This is what Magnus's moment of arrogance cost. Not just the Webway project, not just the dream of a humanity free from warp dependence. but the Emperor himself. Humanity's greatest champion, its most powerful protector, reduced to an eternal struggle against a closed door in a basement, as while the civilization he built bleeds and suffers and contracts around him. Part 8. What actually lives in the Webway? A haunted labyrinth. When someone asks why nobody enters the Webway after Magnus broke it, they usually mean the specific human-built section beneath Terra. But the question has a broader answer too, because the state of the entire Webway in the 41st millennium is deeply, genuinely terrifying for anyone who thinks about it carefully. The original Eldar Webway, the vast network inherited from the old ones and expanded by the ancient civilization, was already badly damaged before Magnus did anything. The fall of the Eldar, the cataclysm of Slanesh's birth that consumed their civilization around 10,000 years before the current era, ruptured the Webway in countless places. The energies of the fall, as the birth scream of a chaos god, tore through the dimensional fabric and left sections of the network compromised, breached, or simply lost. Even in the golden age of the Eldar Empire, the Webway was not some simple highway where you could just walk in any door and trust that every passage was safe and clearly marked. It was already a labyrinth in the truest sense of the word, a network complex enough that even many of the Eldar themselves did not know all its routes. After the fall, with damaged sections and compromised walls and demonic entities that had seeped through the breaches and made themselves at home, it became something significantly more dangerous. In the 41st millennium, what lives in the Webway ranges from the merely alarming to the comprehensively lethal. The Psychnuin are native to the Webway, or possibly native to the Imperium and capable of navigating the Webway, and they are one of those creatures that sounds almost harmless until you understand what they actually do. They look like enormous wasps, 2.5 meters of spindly, psychically active arthropod with a reproductive strategy that is one of the most disturbing things in the galaxy, even by the standards of a setting that contains things like Tyranids and the Drukhari. A female Psychnuin is drawn to psychic emanations, to the mental signatures of psychers. When it finds a suitable host, it psychically projects its eggs directly into the host's brain, not into their body in some generic sense, into their brain. The eggs hatch overnight and begin consuming the host's neural tissue. By morning, the host is in agony. By evening, the Psychnuin grubs have completed their work and the host is dead, and new Psychnuin emerge from what remains. Entire regions of the Webway have been sealed off by the Eldar specifically because of Psychnuin infestations that have grown beyond what can be safely managed. They are drawn to psychers, which means that any Imperial expedition into the Webway, which would almost certainly include psychers as part of its composition, would be actively hunted by these things from the moment it entered. Then there are the demon-touched sections, passages where the walls have been breached and demonic entities have moved in, sometimes transforming entire sections of the Webway into extensions of the warp itself. The Eldar combat these incursions constantly, the Craftworld Seers working to reinforce the walls and seal the breaches before entire arteries of the network are lost. But the damage from the fall was extensive, and the Webway is vast, and there are simply too many compromised sections for the diminished post-fall Eldar population to address simultaneously. Some sections have been lost for so long that whatever inhabits them now is no longer recognizable as anything from the original demonic taxonomy. Things stranger than demons, things that have been inside the Webway since before the current age. The forgotten reaches of the Webway contain what the Lexicanum lists as Donorian fiends, emotion-eating medusae, and chimerae predators, among other things. These are creatures that have made their homes in abandoned sections of the network, as some of them having been there so long that they predate the fall itself. They are not invaders so much as permanent residents of the network's darkest corridors, beings that have adapted to life in a dimension between dimensions and have no intention of leaving. And beyond all of this, there is the simple problem of navigation. The Eldar use Webway pathstones, fragments of knowledge encoded into physical objects that help them navigate known routes. The Harlequins carry their own knowledge, guided by the divine insight of Commorragh, who knows every path. The Dark Eldar who inhabit Commorragh have long familiarity with the passages near their territory. But for anyone else, the Webway is a maze of such complexity that even having a map does not guarantee you can follow it reliably. The only complete map of the Webway is kept in the Black Library, the secret craft world-sized repository of forbidden Eldar lore that sits somewhere in the deepest, most protected section of the dimensional labyrinth. The Atlas Infernal, an organic map created from the stretched skin of an untouchable, whose veins could be read and reconfigured to show roots, was created before the Horus Heresy and is now outdated by 10,000 years of further damage and change. Even it no longer shows a fully accurate picture. Getting lost in the Webway is a more subtle and final kind of death than getting lost anywhere in real space. The Webway's internal geometry is not stable in all sections. Distances change. Directions shift. Dead ends appear where there should be passages. Passages appear where the map shows walls. And some of the things that live in the Webway specifically exploit this disorientation, waiting at junctions where travelers slow in confusion before closing the distance. The White Scars believe that their Primarch, Jagatai Khan, is still alive inside the Webway, having entered through a Drukhari portal during the Heresy and never returned. Alive perhaps because the Webway's strange relationship with time means that someone inside it might not age in the way real space travelers would. Lost because 10,000 years of damage and change have left the passages that might lead back to the exit in a state of flux that even the most skilled navigator would struggle to resolve. Even the Dark Eldar, who have lived inside the Webway for their entire post-fall existence, or who know its passages better than any other currently existing civilization, treat certain sections of their own territory with extreme caution. Cain's Gate, a physical structure within Commorragh, is sealed and has been sealed for good reason. When it was opened, briefly and catastrophically, in recent events, it released a demonic incursion into the Dark City itself that forced even Asdrubal Vecht, the oldest and most powerful of the Drukhari, to temporarily abandon his seat of power. This is what the Webway is in the 41st millennium, not the gleaming road of the old ones or the elegant transit network of the ancient Eldar Empire. A haunted labyrinth, vast and complex and damaged, full of things that should not exist and dangers that kill in ways that don't show up on any taxonomy. The road is still there. You can still walk it, and if you know the way. But the Webway in its current form is the kind of place where the thing you need to fear most is not knowing what you don't know. Part 9. Why nobody enters. The real reasons. So let us address the question directly, because it has several distinct answers layered on top of each other, and each layer is important. The first and most fundamental reason that the Imperium of Man cannot enter the Webway is the most obvious one. They have no gate. The portal under the Imperial Palace, the one the Emperor constructed as his access point, is sealed. Not temporarily blocked, not currently guarded, not even damaged in a way that might eventually be repaired. It is held shut from the inside by the psychic equivalent of a mountain. And the instant that mountain is removed, the mountain becomes a flood. The only gate the Imperium ever had into the Webway has been functionally permanently closed since the war within the Webway, and will remain closed for as long as the Emperor draws breath. Other Webway gates exist on planets across the galaxy. Many of them remain active in some fashion. But these gates are not under Imperial control, and accessing them without the knowledge or permission of those who do control them is a different kind of problem. The Eldar seal gates leading to their craft worlds specifically to prevent Imperial forces from finding their homes. The Dark Eldar, who have a vested interest in keeping Commorragh exclusive, do not exactly leave their gates open for curious humans to wander through. And unguarded, unmapped, ungated entry into the Webway is not travel. It is suicide with extra steps. The second reason is knowledge. You cannot navigate the Webway without knowing where you are going and how to get there. The Eldar have pathstones and seers, and generations of accumulated navigational knowledge. The Harlequins have Kegorach's divine insight and centuries of personal experience. The The Dark Eldar have been living in the thing for 10,000 years, and even with all of those advantages, these groups suffer losses to the dangers of the network regularly. The Imperium has none of this. They have no maps, no experience, no navigational tools developed specifically for dimensional labyrinth travel. They have, at best, access to fragments of Eldar navigational knowledge in captured pathstones or the notes of inquisitors, like the legendary Bronislaw Chevak, and who spent decades inside the Webway and emerged changed but alive, and with a partial understanding of some of its roots. But partial knowledge in the Webway is arguably more dangerous than no knowledge at all, because it creates a false confidence that might lead a traveler to make a wrong turn in a section they thought they understood. The third reason is what the Webway has become. Even if the Imperium somehow solved the first two problems, finding a gate and acquiring navigational knowledge sufficient to make travel feasible, they would be entering an environment that is actively hostile in ways they cannot fully prepare for. The damaged sections, the demonic inhabitants, the psychic predators, the bizarre spatial anomalies in compromised tunnels. And a properly armored and equipped military force could potentially fight its way through some of these dangers, but a military expedition through the Webway would require constant vigilance against threats from multiple directions, including from the walls themselves in the worst sections. And then there is the Eldar, the original architects, the inheritors, the current masters of the network, do not want humans in the Webway. This is not irrational xenophobia, though xenophobia is certainly part of the Eldar character in the 41st millennium. It is a practical calculation based on what the last time humans tried to develop a presence in the Webway cost everyone. The last time a significant human psychic force operated near the Webway's edges, and an entire civilizational project was destroyed, and a 5-year war was fought in the resulting chaos. The Eldar seers have seen the potential consequences of humans in their passages, and have decided, with the cold clarity of a species that has been watching civilizations rise and fall for millennia, that the answer is no. This does not mean the Webway is completely inaccessible to humans. There are precedents. Inquisitor Chevak, as mentioned, spent extended time inside the Webway. The Primarch Vulcan traveled through it during the Heresy, entering through the Imperial Gate, and eventually fighting Magnus in the ruins of Kalistar, dying and reviving countless times before returning. Human Illuminati, a shadowy group of individuals who had survived demonic possession and developed an immunity to chaos corruption, have been granted access to the Black Library by the Eldar Black Council. Rogue traders and inquisitors with the right connections and the right knowledge sometimes make limited use of Webway gates. But these are exceptions, not a road. They are individuals or very small groups, armed with specific knowledge and specific permissions, treading very carefully through a very small portion of a very large labyrinth. They are not the precursor to a human civilization that could use the Webway for anything approaching regular transit. The fourth reason, perhaps the saddest, is what was damaged. The human-built extension of the Webway, the tunnels that the tech priests and unifiers had spent 200 years constructing, was the only section of the network that could have been expanded and modified by human builders. The original Webway is made of materials and principles that the Adeptus Mechanicus cannot replicate or even fully analyze. The human extension was designed precisely to be something they could build more of. It was the seed of what could have become a genuinely human Webway infrastructure. That seed was burned. The tunnels were lost to the demonic incursion that followed Magnus's breach. Whatever remained after the withdrawal was abandoned to things that now call it home, in ways that make reclamation essentially impossible, without the Emperor himself re-establishing the psychic shielding that made construction possible in the first place. And the Emperor is rather occupied at the moment. The fifth reason is the Golden Throne itself. Even if, somehow, impossibly, the portal beneath it were to be cleared of demonic pressure, as the throne is also the mechanism that keeps the Emperor alive, that powers the Astronomicon, and that maintains what limited psychic coherence the Imperium's infrastructure depends on. You cannot shut it down to modify it, cannot open the portal it sits over to do maintenance work, cannot pause the cycle of daily psychic sacrifice that keeps it running. The throne is a failing machine that no one can switch off and no one can adequately repair. It is the Imperium's most important piece of infrastructure and simultaneously the piece of infrastructure it is least able to work on. Part 10. The Thousand Suns Irony, Tzeentch's Long Game. There is a dimension to the story of Magnus's breach that becomes more significant the more carefully you think about it, and it involves the nature of Tzeentch, of the Chaos God, whose name is forever tied to the fate of the Thousand Suns. Tzeentch is the architect of fate, the changer of ways, the entity for whom manipulation and scheming are not merely tools, but the fundamental expression of existence. He sees the future not as fixed points, but as a vast web of possibility, and his singular obsession is with altering the threads of fate in ways that generate the maximum degree of change, complexity, and irony. He does not simply want victories. He wants victories that are also defeats for those who thought they were winning. He wants plans within plans, consequences within consequences, situations where the solution to a problem is simultaneously the source of the next problem. Magnus the Red was his finest work. Consider the chain of events. The Emperor keeps the Webway project secret from Magnus, as perhaps because he knows Magnus's psychic nature might attract exactly the kind of attention that could threaten the project, or perhaps because Magnus was intended to eventually serve as the throne's operator, and the Emperor did not want to put that on him before the project was complete. Either way, Magnus remains ignorant of the single most important thing the Emperor is doing. Magnus, in his ignorance, violates the Council of Nicaea's edicts, uses forbidden sorcery, and in his attempt to save the Imperium from Horus's betrayal, destroys the very project that the Emperor believed was humanity's best hope for long-term survival. The warning is never delivered. The project is ruined. The Emperor is imprisoned. The heresy proceeds largely as Tzeentch and Chaos intended, without the Emperor's direct participation in the military campaign, without the strategic resource that the Webway would have represented. And then, to complete the elaborate cruelty of it, Magnus himself becomes Tzeentch's champion, the being who was perhaps the only one capable of operating the Golden Throne in the Emperor's place, who might have served as the Webway's guardian and allowed the project to eventually be repaired and restarted, instead becomes a demon primarch of the very god whose manipulation caused all of this. The voice that offered Magnus extra power in that critical moment, that was Tzeentch, the changer of ways, reaching across the warp and whispering just the right thing to an already compromised mind in a moment of desperation and pride. Magnus never knew, or if he knew, it was only afterward, when the knowledge was useless. Tzeentch did not just break the Webway, yet he took the person who could have fixed it and made him into one of the reasons it could never be fixed. He imprisoned the Emperor by proxy, crippled humanity's future by using humanity's own best intentions against it, and got one of the most powerful psykers in history as a personal trophy in the process. It is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most successful single acts of manipulation in the entire 40,000 setting. This is also why the story of the Webway sits so heavily in the lore. It is not just a story about a mistake. It is a story about a mistake engineered so precisely that it could not have been avoided without knowledge that was deliberately kept hidden. Magnus was set up. The Emperor's secrecy, however well-intentioned, created the exact blind spot that Tzeentch needed. Every element of the disaster traces back to deliberate manipulation by a god who has been playing this game since before humanity existed. And yet, at the same time, it is genuinely Magnus's fault. He was warned to stop using sorcery. He continued anyway. He was warned not to interfere with the Emperor's work. He did not know what the work was, but he knew there was something sensitive happening. He was offered extra power by a voice in the warp that he could not identify, and he took it without asking too many questions. His arrogance, his certainty that he knew better, his inability to consider that his good intentions might not be sufficient justification for his actions, all of these were his, not Tzeentch's. The god of change gave him a push. Magnus ran off the cliff. Part 11. The Fall of Prospero and What Came After. In the aftermath of the breach, the Emperor dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to Prospero with orders to bring Magnus to Terra. What arrived in Magnus's hands was not that original order. By the time it reached the Space Wolves' commander, Horus had intercepted and altered it. Russ believed he was acting on the Emperor's command to destroy. Magnus, waiting on Prospero for judgment, saw the Space Wolves arrive and still did not fight. He watched his city burn, watched his legion bleed, watched the great pyramids and libraries and archives that he had spent his life building reduced to ash and ruin by warriors who did not know they were doing the wrong thing. He waited until the very last moment, until Leman Russ was about to deliver the killing blow, and only then did he act, using a final ritual to escape into the warp with the remnants of his legion. They emerged in the Eye of Terror, on a world that Tzeentch had prepared for them, the planet of sorcerers, Sortiarius, now orbiting in the maelstrom of chaos alongside the other domains of the traitor legions. Magnus, with his homeworld destroyed and his legion broken, and the realization settling in that his attempt to save the Imperium had destroyed the Imperium's best hope, made his choice. He joined Horus's rebellion, not from conviction, but from despair. The Thousand Suns story from that point is a tragedy within a tragedy. The flesh change, the mutation that Magnus had bargained so hard to stop, came back with a vengeance under the influence of Tzeentch. Ahriman, the chief librarian and Magnus's most brilliant student, took desperate action, performing the rubric of Ahriman in an attempt to stop the mutation for good. The ritual worked, in the sense that the flesh change stopped. It worked badly, in the sense that every non-Psyker Thousand Sun was turned to dust, their bodies becoming empty suits of armor, driven by the echo of their former will. They became the rubric Marines, among the most haunting figures in the 40k setting, warriors whose humanity was literally burned away. And Magnus, who had done everything he could to preserve his legion, presided over its transformation into exactly the kind of soulless shells he had always feared becoming. There is a specific bitter irony in what the Thousand Suns are in the 41st Millennium. They are a legion of sorcerers and scholars who once dedicated themselves to understanding the warp and protecting humanity from it. So they are now among the most active forces pressing against the boundaries of the Imperium, seeking to break what remains of the galaxy's defenses and complete what Horus began. Magnus himself, who saw the future clearly enough to predict the heresy, cannot see a path forward that doesn't involve destroying the civilization he was created to protect. Tzeentch's work, 10,000 years later, remains the defining shape of the setting. Part 12. The current state. The Great Rift makes everything worse. If you thought the Webway situation in the 41st Millennium could not become more desperate, the opening of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, has a few thoughts on that assumption. At the end of the 41st Millennium, culminating in the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon, the despoiler and the destruction of Cadia, the galaxy suffered a wound that makes even the fall of the Eldar look localized. A tear in reality stretching from the Eye of Terror in the northwest all the way to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe, a literally galaxy-spanning chain of warp storms that rent the Imperium in two. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Cursed Scar, the Mouth of Ruin. The Great Rift's effect on the Webway has been profound and deeply alarming even to the Eldar, who have seen a great deal in their long existence. The shockwaves of the Rift's opening battered the Webway across its entire length, collapsing stable subrealms, overloading gates into screaming rents that emptied directly into the Immaterium, reopening closed sections that the Eldar had sealed for good reasons. Sections of the Webway that were previously navigable became impassable overnight. The Eldar have feared that the cicatrix maledictum could, if its effects continue to compound, actually break the Webway outright. Not damage it further, break it. A concern serious enough that all of the Eldar factions, Craftworld Eldari, Drukhari, even the Harlequins, have been engaged in emergency collaboration to contain and repair what they can. Even the Black Library, hidden in the deepest and most protected section of the Webway, was not immune. A section of the library fell into the warp during the Great Rift's formation, taken by Slaanesh and tainted beyond recovery. The most secure location in the entire Webway, the place that had been protected by the greatest guardians and the most powerful wards the Eldar possessed, lost a portion of itself to chaos. Within Commorragh, then, at the eruption of Cain's Gate during the same period of apocalyptic events at the end of the 41st millennium, released a demonic incursion into the Dark City itself. The city that had survived the fall, that had endured every catastrophe the galaxy had thrown at it for 10,000 years, found itself fighting a war in its own streets against the forces of chaos. Vect himself, the supreme overlord, was forced to abandon his seat of power and operate from outposts while the city descended into a chaos that would take years to contain. In the aftermath of the Great Rift's formation, Robut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, was resurrected and returned to the galaxy to lead the Indomitus Crusade. He looked at the state of the Imperium and said, famously, the words that have become the unofficial motto of the era Indomitus, something to the effect that there is hope and that it is worth fighting for, but that the situation is as bad as it looks. The Webway is as bad as it looks. The road that could have saved humanity is older and more damaged than it has ever been. Its previous owners are fighting for their survival and cannot share it even if they wanted to. The being who was trying to build a human version of it is trapped in the basement of his own palace holding a door shut, and the galaxy has just added a brand new set of wounds to an infrastructure that was already struggling. The question of why nobody enters the Webway after Magnus broke it is, in the end, not really a question about the Webway at all. It is a question about the shape of tragedy. And it is a question about what it costs when the most important project in the history of a civilization is destroyed at its most vulnerable moment by an act that was simultaneously a mistake, a manipulation, and a genuinely well-intentioned attempt to do the right thing. The Webway Road is still there. The gates are still there, many of them. The tunnels still glow in their space between spaces, still connect worlds that would otherwise be separated by years of warp-racked travel. But the key was broken. The guide was taken. The maps were lost. And the man who could have put it all back together was turned into the reason it could never be fixed. That is the true answer to why nobody enters the Webway after Magnus broke it. Not because the doors are gone, not because the road has vanished, but because what was needed to walk it safely, to navigate it, to build more of it, to connect it properly to human civilization, and give humanity a fighting chance at something better than an endless war of attrition against the dark, was taken away in a single night. A night when a red-haired Primarch sat in his tower on Prospero, peering into the future he could read like a book, seeing the betrayal coming and choosing to act, choosing what seemed like the obvious, urgent, necessary thing, choosing wrong. The road that could have changed everything is still out there, stretching across the galaxy in the dark between dimensions, waiting for someone who knows the way. Nobody knows the way anymore, not for us. Epilogue, the dream that might have been. Stand still for a moment and let yourself imagine it. Imagine an Imperium where the Emperor completed the Webway project, or where the portal under the Imperial Palace was not sealed shut, but thrown open, humanity's highway to the stars, where the Emperor stood up from the golden throne and walked out into the galaxy he had spent his entire existence trying to protect, where there was no war within the Webway, no daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls to keep a failing machine running, no Horus heresy tipping point where everything the Emperor had built began to bleed. Imagine an Imperium that travels the way the Eldar once traveled, slipping through dimensional passages without exposing itself to the warp's predations, without the constant attrition of ships lost in transit, without the nightmare of navigator families holding the keys to galactic commerce, without the creeping madness of the Imperium bleeding into every corner of human existence, was imagined chaos starved, not defeated, not destroyed, because it draws on emotions that conscious life will always produce. But its most abundant source of food, the psychic richness of humanity's billions upon billions of souls, placed behind a barrier that chaos cannot easily reach. Not sealed away forever, not perfect, but reduced in accessibility, until a humanity that is evolving into something more psychically mature can eventually take that next step and leave the need for the warp's intermediary role behind altogether. That was what the Emperor was trying to build. Not just a road, a future. A specific, mapped, detailed future in which humanity survived and eventually transcended the dangers that surrounded it. It is gone. It was taken in one night, or by a voice in the warp that said just the right thing to a mind that was already too proud to hear the answer it did not want. The Webway still exists. The universe still contains, in that space between dimensions, the architecture of a dream that never came to pass. And somewhere in the deepest passages of the labyrinth dimension, past the haunted sections and the sealed gates and the territories of beings that should not exist, the Black Library sits in the dark with all the knowledge of all the things that have ever been wrong with the galaxy, and all the knowledge of all the things that might someday be right. The Harlequins walk those passages. The Laughing God's children, armed with ancient knowledge and the madness of grief transformed into art, performing their plays in the ruins of civilizations for audiences that may not live to see the end. They know the way. The question is whether anyone will ever get to ask them. If you have been sitting with all of this and feeling that particular 40,000 sensation of everything being enormous and important and heartbreaking all at once, you are exactly where this story is supposed to take you. The Webway is one of those pieces of lore that rewards sitting with it, because every layer you pull back reveals another layer underneath, and every answer generates 3 more questions that are even better. If you want more deep dives into the lore that actually matters, the questions at the heart of the 40k setting, the stories that make it more than just a game about space soldiers, then hit that like button so the algorithm notices that you are interested in the good stuff. Subscribe if you want more of this delivered to you quietly and without fuss. If you have thoughts, a theory about Magnus's culpability, a take on whether the Emperor could theoretically release the door and let it be someone else's problem, or a reading of Tzeentch's long game that sees it differently than the version laid out here, leave it in the comments. There is something good in knowing that other people are also sitting in the dark, thinking about ancient roads and broken promises and the specific shape of the tragedy that made the galaxy what it is. The lore is vast. Come back and we will keep going.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.